In this video, I'd be talking about basic client-server interaction. The client sends an HTTP request to the server, and the server processes the request and sends back an HTTP response. And here are the key elements of the request. HTTP method, that is the action to be performed. It could be get, post, or there are a bunch of others which are rarely used. And the page to be accessed, which identifies the resource to be requested for, and the form parameters like the arguments to a method. And the key elements of the response stream would involve a status code, because the client has sent the server request. The response would include the status of the request, whether it has been processed or whether it was successful or not, and also the content type. So the content type, if the request was successful, then the resource is returned, and the content type identifies the resource, the type of the resource being sent back to the client. The actual content, could be an image, an HTML page, and so on. Okay, so the user clicks on a link in the browser, and when the link is clicked on, either an HTTP GET message is sent, or an HTTP POST message is sent to the server. So this is how a GET request looks like. Well, it's the HTTP method. This is called the request line, which has the HTTP method as well as the URL and the protocol that the web browser uses to communicate with the server. The HTTP method is get, and this is the URL that I'm trying, or the resource on the web server that I'm trying to access, and these are the parameters, which are separated by ampersand, and the protocol that my client uses to communicate with the server, and this is the host to the client URL. Sorry, this is a server URL. The type of web client, what sort of file types does my web server, or does my web browser accept, and what sort of encoding scheme does it accept, gzip and deflate, what sort of character set does my web browser support, and other parameters. So in this case, the form data is appended to the URL, and sent to the server. In case of post, however, there's a request line, request headers, just like in here. And then you would state in the request line, you would state the HTTP method as well as the URL you're trying to access, but the form data is not appended. Right, and the protocol version, again, the protocol name and the version that the client uses to talk to the server, the same, the host URL, that is the server URL, again the same content, and followed by the payload, which is the form data. This time the parameters are down in the body, so they're not limited the way they are if you use a get and to put them in the request line. This is how a response looks like. It has got, again, the protocol and the version and the status of the request, the HTTP status code for the response, and a text version of the status code, and content type is sent to the browser, so the browser could render um, the response in a proper format, right? So these belong to HTTP response headers, and the body holds the actual content. Something like this, you send a request, and then the server says, here's my response to your request. Its type is text HTML, but in your request you said that is okay, so unless you were lying to me. Okay, so uh, in the request, if you have noticed this, the browser said it can accept text HTML, and that's what the browser that's what the client is saying. Text HTML is okay for the browser based on the request that the browser has sent to the server. Now let's put everything together. So the user types in the URL, the browser creates or clicks on a link, and the browser creates an HTTP get request, and this is the request format for get, which is sent to the server. The server finds the page or the resource, and it again creates a response headers, and and um, it sends back a response to the server. So this would be HTML within the payload of the response header of the response message sent by the server to the client. So it actually finds the page at this point, and then it generates an HTTP response, with the headers as well as the body, and then it is sent back to the client, and so the browser receives it, and the browser renders the HTML, um, and then the client looks forward to write whatever. Okay, let's take a look at what the URL contains. URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator. It has got the protocol that the client and server talk with, and then it has got the URL, the host name, the unique name of the physical server you're looking for, and the name maps to a unique IP address. Um, you could also specify an IP address instead of a name, the port number that the server is running on the server side, and the path of the resource, as well as you could also have an optional query string with the data if you're using get method. So let's talk a little bit about ports. So if I send an HTTP request, I would expect the HTTP process running on the server to listen to it, because technically it's the only HTTP process would understand and could process HTTP requests. So if I were to use HTTPS, it has a different way of understanding the messages sent by the client. So I need to make sure that the message or the request that I'm sending to the server is accepted by the right process, so which is HTTP server process running on port 80. If I were to use if I were to send an FTP request, then I would specify port 21, and 0 to 1023 ports are TCP ports, and they're reserved. So whenever you want to use your own port, make sure you don't use any one of the ports within this range. In a simple So if you were to have a web server, say Apache, and if you have static resources to be served to the client, then you would have it saved in htdocs, because Apache server will assume htdocs is a directory that is the root for all the servers web applications. Okay. Um, so by default, this is a page that is served, and if you want say another page, say this one here, then you would have to type in peer advice as part of the URL path in the as part of the resource path in the URL. Now, in this case, the server can only serve static web pages. In order to make the server serve dynamic web pages, the server makes use of a helper application. Like in the case of CGI, you have something like this, in which the client sends request for a dynamic resource, which the web server certainly cannot provide it. So it takes in the request, forwards the params to the helper application, which would generate the page on the run and give it back to the web server, which would further forward it to the client. Let's take a look at how servlets are created. You could organize your project directory in such a way that you have source classes and some other files to be put in the directory. So you could group all your source code into src directory and compile it to the classes directory. Right, and every servlet or web application has a deployment descriptor, which is an XML file defined in web.xml. You could only have one deployment descriptor per web application, and deployment descriptor can declare many servlets. Okay, so the servlet name ties the class name of the servlet with the user identified URL name. Okay, so I'm sorry. So this is the URL pattern that the user identifies, and this is the actual class name. So how do you link both of them together? By an internal name, which is called the servlet name, which links the URL pattern to the servlet class that has to be executed upon the request. So Tomcat, if you were to deploy your application in Tomcat, you would be having you'd be deploying your application within web apps folder of Tomcat. So within web apps, I've created a subfolder ch1 in which I am deploying these folders here. So I don't need my source. So in web-inf, you need to put in your web.xml. In classes, you put in your classes. So that's how Tomcat recognizes your servlets. This is a standard way of deploying your application with Tomcat. And you start up your Tomcat and open your browser and type in this. So you type in ch1 servlet 1. So servlet 1 is mapped to chapter 1 servlet, which is again mapped to ch1 servlet. So this here so when you say this, it would go into ch1 and look at the web.xml file and look for serv1 within the deployment descriptor, and then it looks at serv1 and maps it to ch1 servlet and processes that.